Titus Livius, typically known as Livy to English-speaking audiences, is easily the best known and most widely read of Rome's historians. He worked under the direction of the Emperor Augustus to create a definitive account of Rome's history in 142 books. The first book covers Rome's early history, beginning several generations prior to the foundation of the city by Romulus down to the overthrow of the last king and the establishment of the Republic in 509 to 508 BCE. Here we will examine the outlines of the Roman tradition of early Rome, highlighting some points of disagreement with Dionysius of Halicarnassus. We will also look at the influence of Augustan-era politics on how Livy understood and crafted the history of early Rome. Finally, we will consider how some of the stories in Livy formed an important part of the Roman identity, and what Rome's early experiences and monarchs meant to the generation which saw the Republic give way to the Empire. If we look at most of Livy's predecessors, both those who wrote in Greek and those who wrote in Latin, we see that most of them did hail from eminent families in Rome. However, none of them came from a family which had established a monopoly on military power. Titus Livius, therefore, had a massive advantage over all of his rivals. His name is Titus Livius in Latin, but most English speakers simply refer to him as Livy. He was born around the year 60 BCE and died around the year 15 CE. This means that he was a close contemporary of both his distant relative, the Emperor Augustus, and also a close contemporary of the Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who wrote a rival account at around the same time. Livy used his connections to write Ab Urbe Condita, the history of Rome from the foundation of the city, or just from the foundation of the city if you take the title literally. This work was 142 books long. Just by way of review, a book in ancient terms is as much as you could fit on a single scroll. If you were to translate a scroll into English, you typically end up with around 80 or so standard pages. So, to give context, what we're talking about here with Livy's Book 1 is only 1/142nd of what he wrote. And yet, this covers 250 plus years of Roman history, this one book, whereas later books often cover a very small selection of Roman history. For instance, one of the books of Livy covers the Battle of Cannae, and the battle and the campaign leading up to it and the immediate aftermath are basically all the contents of that entire book. So, as we can tell, the amount of information that Livy had at his disposal for early Rome, even as an extremely well-connected guy, was still rather limited. And as we'll see, he spends some of the space in Book 1 discussing what previous writers have said and weighing the merits of various interpretations of early Rome's history. His work did run up to the present, but most of the later books in Livy's Ab Urbe Condita have been lost, and in fact what we have remaining to us is only a fairly small selection of the original. Although even in its very much diminished state, Livy's work is still probably the longest Latin language history that we have from antiquity. Livy's work was destined to become the official account of Roman history insofar as the Romans were concerned. This should come as no surprise since he did work under the aegis of the Emperor Augustus, who was his political benefactor, and also, as I mentioned, a relative. We can see in Livy's narrative that he very much does have a pro-Augustus bias, something that we will revisit. Interesting side note about Livy, he was also related to his grandnephew Claudius. Claudius was an intelligent and intellectually curious young man, but he was barred from holding public office by Augustus because he suffered from some mild disabilities. Suetonius tells us that Claudius had a tendency to drag his foot a bit, so he had something of a limp, and he also drooled a little. Augustus thought that that made him undignified, and that effectively senators would not be willing to follow orders from Claudius, and he would embarrass the family, so he more or less banished Claudius from the public spotlight. However, Claudius was an intelligent man, and he didn't want to while away his life in solitude, So Livy mentored him and taught him the art of history. As an adult, Claudius wrote a history of Carthage in 8 books or so. We're told that it was pretty good, but we don't really know since it's been lost. Had it survived, it actually would be a considerable addition to our knowledge of Carthage, which is rather limited. Claudius had no real prospects of serving in politics until the accession of his nephew Caligula, who needed a friendly relative in place to help shore up his own authority, since he himself was very young. So Claudius, while he was well in the middle age, was now made a consul. And then, of course, Caligula gets assassinated, which leads to Claudius becoming emperor in 41 and serving until his death in 54. So Livy did not know that he was mentoring a future emperor, but in effect, that is exactly what he ended up doing. I would like for you to think back to the last lecture when we talked about Dionysius of Halicarnassus and his version of events for the foundation of Rome. In his account, the Greeks had featured very prominently, arriving in central Italy to combine forces with the Aborigines and to remove the Sicels from Rome. From there, the people had intermingled and founded Rome. Dionysius, of course, was trying to Hellenize the Romans by literally making them Greek, since some of their ancestors were in fact Greek, according to him. This served 2 purposes. One was literally making the Romans more Greek through blood, and the other was explaining why the Romans couldn't remember this happening. The Roman tradition before Dionysius was that there had been a mixture of people who had settled in Rome under Romulus, and that they had lost their early identities in favor of the new one. And so Dionysius takes advantage of that to insert Greeks into the story. Fairly clever stuff. Livy seems to be well aware of what Dionysius and other Greek historians were up to, and while he does not name Dionysius by name, he does show a great deal of awareness of this tradition, and he clearly does not agree. In fact, in Livy's narrative of Roman history, the Greeks don't make an appearance until the time of Numa Pompilius, whose reign is traditionally dated to begin in 713 or so BCE. Livy is at pains to explain why Numa could not have learned his wisdom from the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, and actually Livy makes a very compelling case in this instance. If we look at the known dates of Pythagoras, he was a philosopher who lived in the 6th century down into the 5th, which means that he was not alive for another 100 years after the reign of Numa. So Livy is very much of the opinion that Numa is someone who mostly produced his own wisdom and certainly did not derive any of it from the Greeks. He does give the Greeks credit for one particular rite that the Romans had. He said that a Greek named Evander had taught Numa a particular rite. But otherwise, all of the other rites that Numa instituted as king were ones which he either discovered or learned from some other non-Greek source. So, in other words, what Livy is doing is examining the idea that Rome owes something significant to the Greeks for their cultural formation, and he dismisses it out of hand completely. If the Greeks are conspicuous by their absence in Livy's narrative, then it must be said that Aeneas and the Trojans are conspicuous by their absence in Dionysius of Halicarnassus. You might wonder why that is the case. Well, so far as we can tell, Livy and his contemporary, the poet Virgil, were the first to really try to systematically shoehorn Aeneas and his Trojans into Rome's origin story. Before this time, there is little to no evidence that the Romans thought of themselves as being related to the Trojans. There are differences between the way that they do it, however, so we can see that each author applied a certain amount of creativity to the way that they worked Aeneas and the Trojans into Roman history. In Virgil's Aeneid, there's an entire book where Aeneas' fleet is blown to Africa where they meet the Carthaginians under Queen Dido, and Aeneas has a romance with her. Eventually, although things are going well between himself and Dido, Aeneas decides that his destiny lies in Italy, and so he departs. This, of course, leads Dido to commit suicide and force her people to swear vengeance on the Romans, thus leading to the brutal rivalry between Rome and Carthage in the Punic Wars. That doesn't happen in Livy, at least not in Book 1. The reason why this element is absent from Dionysius is twofold. One, it doesn't fit with Dionysius' agenda, which is to make the Romans more Greek, since the Trojans are not Greek. And two, this was not something that he found in earlier writers, because this was something that was very much a product of the age of Augustus. So why would Augustus and his artist, Livy and Virgil, want to put Aeneas and the Trojans into their history? Well, I think the answer is fairly simple. The Trojans are people who had disappeared. So the Romans claiming kinship with them, and thereby claiming some sort of equality with them, is safe. They don't have to share any rights with the Trojans because the Trojans have disappeared. And by claiming this Trojan heritage, they also give themselves justification for their conquest of Greece. This was revenge many centuries later. It was righting the wrong of the Trojan War. So when the Greeks came to them and said, "You owe us a great deal culturally," the Romans said, "We also owed you a great debt in blood, and we certainly paid that, now didn't we?" Livy faces something of a challenge. He has been instructed to work Aeneas and the Trojans into Roman history, but Rome's history/mythology already has a founding father, and that is Romulus. Romulus is the eponymous founder of Rome, and so far as we can tell, he appears in every early version of Rome's history and mythology. He is the beginning point of Roman history and had been for a long time. So how do you get Aeneas into the story? Well, Livy gets fairly creative, and he effectively creates a convoluted path by which the Trojan heritage was passed on from Aeneas to Romulus. He can't do this directly by having Aeneas go to Rome, of course, because Romulus is the one who founds the city. So in order to do this, he needs to found two new communities where there were Trojan settlers who became localized, and then those two communities had to contribute to Rome. So let's talk about how Livy has this play out. When Aeneas arrives in Italy, he founds a city of Lavinium named after his wife Lavinia, who was the daughter of the Latin king. The Latin king's name was Latinus, because he then lends his name to the Latin people. Once Aeneas lives his life and then passes on, his son, Ascanius, or as Livy tells us, perhaps this man was not actually Aeneas' son, but rather a cousin, or even someone who was barely related, but still probably Trojan, left in order to found a new city, Alba Longa. These two cities were both in the area of Latium, but interestingly enough, Livy never tells us exactly where. Both cities continue to develop for several generations, and we just have the names of kings as they lived and died. Eventually, we get two twins being born at Alba Longa after the rape of their mother, who was a Vestal virgin. Their grandfather, the king, ordered the infants to be exposed, and they were ultimately taken in and raised by a local childless couple. This is at the time when the shepherd who found them happened to note that the two infants were being milked by a she-wolf, so that is where that fits into the story. Although Livy tells us that perhaps that part of the story was completely made up, and that the adopted mother had once been a prostitute with the nickname of the Wolf. I have no idea how a prostitute gets the nickname the Wolf, but that is something I really wish he had elaborated on more, because I think that was a missed opportunity for Livy. Eventually, of course, the two twins go back to Alba Longa, claim their inheritance, and then go to Rome, which is the same site they had been exposed at. Romulus kills Remus, and you know the rest. Romulus' successors ultimately establish Rome's dominion over Latium, and conveniently enough, they absorb the people of Lavinium and Alba Longa, and then raze the sites of the cities, sparing, of course, the shrines and temples there, in order to be as pious as possible. And that fits in with Livy's narrative of how Rome expanded. Every time they would conquer a neighboring city, they would have the people pack up their stuff and move to Rome to become Romans, and then raise the city so that it would no longer exist. So the fact that the Romans do this to Lavinium and Alba Longa also has the convenient effect of making it a null and void question to ask, well, can I visit those sites today, Livy? Where are they? Well, they've been lost, of course, because we had to destroy them to reunite all of the descendants of Troy and then bring them into Rome. There are people, by the way, today who claim that they have found Lavinium and Alba Longa in Latium, and many of them are locals. However, the probability that they are correct about this and not just engaging in optimistic thinking or trying to get tourists to come visit their little villages, the odds of them being correct are somewhere in the vicinity of 0.0. It's very clear to me by reading Livy's account that these two cities are both inventions which never existed outside of literature. Let's move on from discussing Livy's quarrels with other historians and his attempt to make the Romans into latter-day Trojans. And instead, let's focus on the contents of Book 1. Book 1 contains many of the most important stories in Roman mythology/history. The stories that Livy recounts are some of the ones which do the most to really form Rome's identity. And because of Livy's stature and his imperial endorsement, his versions of these stories will be the canon. One thing that Livy does pretty frequently is to lay out the etymological origins of various places and institutions. What he does typically is to try to find an eponymous founder, or the person who effectively lent his name to a thing. It was the belief of Livy and many of his predecessors in the field of history that things are frequently just named after the person or group which discovered/founded them. To give two easy and obvious examples, Aeneas's opponent and possible father-in-law, Latinus, was king of the Latins, and they derived their name from him. So if Livy, Virgil, and others are correct, then the Latin language, the region of Latium, and the Latin people all derived their name from an obscure king named Latinus, whose main achievement was failing to keep out a group of raiders from Troy. Of course, Rome itself was named after Romulus, and the story goes that had Romulus lost to Remus, the city may have been named Romoria in honor of Remus. But, of course, that is not how things played out unless you live in an alternative universe. Roman mythology, unlike Greek mythology, focused almost entirely on men. And the first man in Roman history was, of course, Romulus. After he murdered his brother, he founded the city of Rome, and he invited some of his followers from Alba Longa and from other communities to join him. Most of the men who ended up coming with Romulus were men of ill repute. Some of them were sons of families who would not inherit a farmstead. Some of them were debtors. Some of them were escaped murderers. But all of them had something in common. They were looking for a second chance. Once they settled in at their new home, they now had some access to land, and they were no longer refugees. However, their reputation apparently left something of a mark. Romulus went to neighboring cities and tried to negotiate for marriages to be arranged between his men and women in surrounding communities. Because of the lack of positive repute among Romulus's followers, all of the leaders of neighboring communities refused. And what follows is what can only be described as the most incel story to ever occur. Romulus and his men decided that they needed wives and they deserved wives, therefore they would have them. So Romulus and his men resorted to a ruse. They held a great religious festival at the new city of Rome and invited all of the surrounding communities to attend. People arrived with their families, and the Romans decided to hide out and pick out women for themselves. Naturally, of course, the senators got to choose the most desirable women, and then while the men who had visited were distracted with plays and other entertainments, Roman men ran out of hiding to snatch up women and abduct them. Naturally, of course, the people who were relatives of these women were not too thrilled, but they thought that if they engaged in thoughtful diplomacy that Romulus would realize the error of his ways and send the women back home. Instead, however, Romulus and his men forced themselves on these women, called the rape of the Sabine Women, and they were forced to bear babies for the Romans. As soon as the babies were born, or around that time, the victims of this grand abduction and rape plot decided to get even, and there were 3 separate armies which were raised and set out for Rome. The first 2 came from nearby communities, and Romulus and his men were able to trounce them easily and then force peace upon them. They said that those men, if they wanted to see their daughters, would have to abandon their home cities and move to Rome, where they could then live as Romans. When the Sabines arrived, however, they were the most powerful and numerous of Rome's new enemies, and they would not be able to get swept aside so easily. As the 2 armies were squaring off for an epic encounter, the women who had been abducted from the Sabines and were now Roman mothers ran out unarmed with their babies between the 2 battle lines, saying that they were unwilling to see either their new husbands or their birth families be butchered for nothing. They wanted the best for their new children, and the best was to have a full family. Ashamed of themselves, both the Romans and the Sabines put down their arms, and they agreed to live amicably together. Livy's a bit loose on the details of how that happened. Plutarch later will have an account of this, where effectively Romulus and the Sabine king lived as colleagues until the Sabine king died, Titus Tatius. But the point is that basically the Romans got away with abducting and raping a huge number of women because they couldn't find wives any other way, which is why I said this is the ultimate incel story. And you might think, well, how did the Romans later claim to be the most virtuous and oath-abiding people to ever live? Well, their reputation for being oath-abiding and lawful came later under their second king, 1. But also, with the Romans, they, throughout their history, would demonstrate a remarkable ability to always portray themselves as the good guys, even when it's very clear that they're the aggressors. And effectively, Romulus and the Romans absolved themselves of wrongdoing in this instance because they said that when Romulus went to the women to tell them that this was their lot in life and to accept that everything would be good, the women agreed with him. Therefore, everything was fine. And later on, the women showed that they were happy with their new lives because they intervened and forbade their fathers and brothers from killing their new husbands. So, the Romans basically, with this story, adopted a all's well that ends well approach to things. Yeah, we did some abduction, we did some rape, we started a big war, but it was all just a comedy of errors, and we're all happier now, and everything's cool, so yay us. We're still the heroes and the good guys. And that is the story of the Sabine women. The paintings about the Sabine women, including this one, where the women famously intervene, were mostly done by the Napoleonic-era painter Jacques-Louis David. Also, a fun side note, the Sabine women story also has implications for what Romans expected out of Roman women. Unlike Greek women who tended to be demure and were expected to be more seen than heard, Roman women were expected to take a fairly active part in their children's lives and to speak out to their husbands and other men about what was best for their families. And as we'll see later on with Roman history, Roman women were fairly assertive. And there were Roman women who played some relatively large roles in the affairs of their time. Another famous old Roman story which took its mature form in Livy's Book 1 is the story of the Horatii. During Rome's final war with Alba Longa, the Horatii were one of the noble families which took a huge lead in this war, despite the fact that Rome at this time was under the leadership of one of its kings. Livy himself is not sure whether the Horatii or the other family were actually the Romans, but he assumes that they were the Romans and the other family were the Alba. Whether it makes a difference to the story, we can't say since we have no other version of it. However, the story is that you had an older father who is the paterfamilias, and he has 3 adult male sons, all of whom are beastly warriors, who are the best champions that Rome has. His sons swear that they will not rest until Rome has emerged victorious in this war, and they have subjugated the Alba once and for all. In the course of this war, the 2 families suffer some grievous losses. 2 of the Horatii brothers are killed in battle, and the third is the last one standing. He ends up slaying the last of the brothers from the other family. And then, with that victory, the Romans have prevailed over the Alba, and the process of integrating Alba into Rome will get underway. As he's walking back to Rome with his slain opponent over his shoulder, Horatius happens to see his sister, who mourns the death of the man he has slain, since that is her fiancé. Enraged, young Horatius pulls out his sword, declares his sister's grief to be completely un-Roman and unacceptable, and kills her on the spot in front of his fellow citizens. The king at the time, while horrified, did not want to do anything because he said that he owed too great of a debt to the Horatii for their noble sacrifice. So he deferred the problem to a court, and there was a trial for, of course, murdering the sister. At this trial, the father of Horatius showed up to defend his son, and he effectively said, yes, my son is guilty, but he has done great things for Rome, so we should have some pity on him. And also, if you are so kind as to pardon my son, I will build a grand and impressive temple that will benefit the community by improving our relationship with the gods. Ultimately, the jury did acquit Horatius and took up the father's offer. The father then went on to found a great temple, and the Horatii lived on to commit murder another day. Exactly what the point of the story is might seem a bit obscure at first, but the overall point that Livy is trying to convey, and no doubt that previous tellers of the story were trying to convey, is that one's loyalty to Rome and willingness to sacrifice for Rome comes before all else. And not only should you be willing to do your utmost for Rome, but you should be willing to grant as much leniency as possible to those who also are willing to fight and die for Rome, even if that means being a bit flexible with the rules of, say, murder. So basically, this is a patriotic story, and of course, it also might owe quite a bit to the traditions of the Horatii family itself, although we don't really know for sure, and by the time that Livy wrote, the Horatii family, to the best of my knowledge, was long gone. According to Livy, Rome had 7 kings who reigned between 753, when Romulus founded the city, and 509, when the final king was driven out by Brutus and the Senate. Each one of these 7 kings contributed something of significance to Roman culture, whether it was his personal example or even fundamental institutions and norms, thus making all 7 of the kings cultural heroes. Although, as we'll see, not all of these examples are exactly positive. Cultural heroes exist in many cultures, not just the Roman one. Many of the Greek polis had lawgiver figures in the distant past to whom they would attribute their various traditions. Athens had the king Theseus, and they also had Solon. Sparta had Lycurgus, and so on and so on. In China, there are actually 8 cultural heroes, so fairly comparable to the 7 kings of Rome, known as the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, each one of whom invented something very basic to Chinese culture. One of them invented the cultivation of silk, for instance. So, in Livy's narrative, the 7 kings serve that function. Presumably, there had been some vague awareness that Rome had once had a pre-republican monarchy, and then people had sort of fleshed out the details from there. And the idea is that each one of these kings must have contributed something, otherwise they wouldn't have been allowed to reign in Rome for as long as they did. If we were trying to trace out a literal Roman monarchy, then one thing that gives us an indication that perhaps this tradition is not fully accurate is the fact that almost every reign of the Roman kings lasted for 40 years. And if you know anything about historical monarchies, you know that especially before the advent of modern medicine, it would be very difficult to get kings to live for 40 years back to back to back to back to back, especially if you're switching dynasties pretty much every generation. Human life just doesn't quite work that reliably. So over the course of 250 or so years, you would definitely have more than 7 kings, were this an actual historical account of a Roman monarchy. Not all of Rome's cultural heroes were created equally, however, and so I will not cover all 7 of Rome's kings. I will, however, highlight 3 of them. Romulus I think we can skip, since as I established, he was mostly just the icon of the incels. Numa Pompilius, Romulus's successor, is, at least in my opinion, the most important of Rome's cultural heroes, as he is given credit for instituting nearly all aspects of Roman culture, at least all of the aspects of the Romans themselves regarded as being positive. Well, outside of war-making, that was the only thing he didn't contribute. Numa Pompilius, according to Livy, was a man of great virtue who lived among the Sabines, and had very little interest in politics prior to taking the throne. He was fundamentally a man of peace who abhorred war, and he spent his reign not making war, but rather establishing Rome's legal and religious traditions. Many of these would boil down to coming up with the correct rites to practice when sacrificing to a god, or the correct ways to understand a flight of birds coming from the east at dawn, or other things of that nature. Numa also founded most of Rome's religious orders. One odd contradiction in Livy is that he has Numa have a big influence on the Vestal Virgins, yet earlier we know that Romulus and Remus were born to a Vestal Virgin, which means that there's no way Numa could really have any claim to founding the Order of the Vestals, since they must have pre-existed if Romulus's mother was a Vestal Virgin. But I guess that all gets to what Livy himself said, that when you look at Roman history, at least early Roman history, you're basically looking through a thick fog bank, and that the past is rather obscure and hard to grasp. Later on, when people would debate the validity of this or that rite or ritual, they would effectively label as correct anything that held from Numa, and as incorrect anything that was innovated at a later time. In fact, one of Numa's successors, I believe it was Ancus Marcius, was critiqued specifically because he turned to religion later in life and engaged in superstition that was outside of what Numa had practiced. And so as soon as that king was dead, people agreed to throw out everything that he had said about religion and revert to what Numa had taught. Numa also invented the calendar with intercalary insertions, and designated public and private days. Livy has a different focus than Plutarch when it comes to looking at the significance of the calendar. Plutarch talks a lot about intercalary insertions and trying to get things accurate, whereas for Livy, the emphasis is clearly on the ability to designate public and private days. The Senate was only allowed to meet on days designated for public business, and these were also the only days we could go and deal in the marketplace. On private days, such things were forbidden. And I guess Livy must have understood, at least in his mind, his way of thinking, that being able to control which days were open for business and which days weren't was a massive power play, and that this really shows how Numa governed. One of Numa's most famous foundations was the Temple of Janus. The Temple of Janus had a gate, which when Rome was at war was open, and then when Rome was at peace it would be closed. And Livy points out that under Numa, the gate was always closed, and that would be a rarity. The only other times when this would be the case would be in the immediate aftermath of the First Punic War, when Rome had defeated Carthage, and then in the era of Augustus, so his own time, when Augustus had brought peace to the chaos, and effectively had become in some ways the new Numa, since he had restored peace in a way that the Roman world had not seen in hundreds of years. Let's now fast forward to the 6th and 7th kings of Rome. Servius Tullius was the 6th king of Rome, succeeding the first Tarquin. Tullius was a well-balanced king who was good in both war and peace. Some of Rome's kings were a little bit one-dimensional. Even Numa was one-dimensional in the sense that he never made war, and we have no idea whether he actually could. Servius Tullius, however, could do both. He was competent at both war and peace, and he was smart enough to know that Numa's rights were correct and to just follow them to the letter. If anything, Servius Tullius serves as the model ruler, at least for an already established monarchy. The idea being that he did what he needed to do and didn't rock the boat. However, he did have one big flaw, as far as Livy saw it, and that was failing to eliminate or permanently appease his political rivals. His predecessor Tarquin had sons and grandsons who felt entitled to the throne, and they never gave up on their ambition. Servius Tullius was able to keep them at arm's length for most of his reign. However, as he grew older and weaker, their challenges became much more of a problem for him. Ultimately, as an old man, he was debating with Tarquinius Superbus in the Senate as Tarquinius was trying to call for him to step down and step aside, and Tarquinius simply tossed him down a flight of stairs. Servius Tullius was able to regain his feet, and as his supporters and Tarquinius were fighting, one of Tarquinius' men ran up on him and ran him through with a dagger, thus ending the rivalry, since there was no way Servius Tullius could continue to serve as king now that he was dead. One of the stories that Livy tells us about Servius is that he was supposedly contemplating declaring a republic upon his own death rather than passing the kingdom on or allowing for a new election of another king. This is almost certainly a made-up detail, as it is very rare that kings will, unprompted, try to create a non-monarchical system of government. However, Livy most likely included this detail, or this detail existed in some previous tradition, in order to try to enhance Servius Tullius's reputation for virtue. We have to keep in mind almost all of the historians of Rome were themselves of senatorial stock, so anyone who's pro-Senate is a man of good taste and good character, whereas anyone who is anti-Senate in any way is clearly either just a plain bad person like Tarquinius Superbus, or perhaps even a complete and total madman like Caligula. The 7th and final king of Rome was Tarquinius Superbus. Although his name might look to an English speaker like a form of transportation, or some hint that the man was superb, Superbus actually means the arrogant or the proud. And it was this monarch who convinced the Romans that monarchy as an institution was inherently corrupt, and that the risk of a bad king was such that the Romans should never again allow themselves to be subjected to the rule of a king. Of all of the kings of Rome, he has the best chance by a long shot of being historical. The Senate, of course, was naturally opposed to kingship because this would undermine their prerogatives and prevent them from functioning as an oligarchical government. For them, anytime a fellow senator in historical times would become a little too powerful, they would hit him with the charge of aspiring to become a rex, or king. And then, if they were asked what king this person clearly had in mind, they would cite Tarquinius Superbus. Tarquinius was jealous of his own power. He thought everyone was gunning to get him the way that he had been gunning for Servius Tullius for so many years. So his first move upon his accession was to condemn many of the senators who had supported Servius Tullius in any way, or had challenged him at a later time by speaking out against some of his ideas or practices. Tarquinius Superbus was, in other words, a tyrant who had no regard for freedom of speech. Tarquinius also had sons who were equally arrogant, if not more so. His most important son was named Sextus, and he was responsible for two things that Livy outlines as being outrageous. At one point, Tarquinius and his son Sextus engaged in a fake rivalry in order to gain the trust of the city of, I believe it's called Gabii. So Sextus fled there and claimed that he was planning to get revenge on his father, and he would help them to defend themselves against the Romans so long as they allowed him into their council, and they did. So that was something that Livy declared to be un-Roman, since Romans are supposed to win through valor, not through ruses. That would be bad enough, but then Sextus, who felt entitled to have any woman he wanted because of his royal heritage, raped a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia was outraged by what had happened, and so, despite the pleading of her relatives, she declared that her honor had been too badly damaged for her to go on. She committed suicide in public and made her relatives swear to avenge her death and get rid of Tarquinius. This led to a revolt by senators under the leadership of Brutus and Tarquinius Collatinus, who not only drove out the Tarquins, killing Sextus in battle and forcing Tarquinius Superbus to reside in exile, and then founding the Republic. So Tarquinius Superbus was a bad enough king that the Romans decided, we will never, ever again empower anyone else to serve as king. And part of the reason why Tarquinius Superbus is so important for Romans of the late Republic and early Empire is precisely because they were returning to a time of monarchs. And the question becomes, how does one overcome this strong prejudice against kings? And how does one avoid the reign of another Tarquinius Superbus? So let's now circle back to Livy's role as Augustus's historian. Livy clearly does support Augustus, and he mentions Augustus positively on several occasions as a man who brought peace, and I think implicitly he talks about Augustus when he talks about some of the more virtuous figures from Rome's past. Whether Livy simply supported Augustus because Augustus was a relative, or whether he genuinely admired the man, we'll never know, although I actually suspect it was the latter. Augustus, even though he was an absolute ruler in many ways, he did not really crack down on free speech the way that, say, Tarquinius Superbus supposedly did. So if Livy did have some critiques, he most likely could have written them and gotten away with it. Of course, his history then would not have survived because it would not have gotten the imperial stamp of approval, and it also would not have gotten the big publicity tour that no doubt Livy's work got, but it still would have not earned him a death sentence, most likely. If we look at the way that Livy sets up Rome's early history, we could see some parallels between the careers of Caesar and Augustus. When we look at Romulus's reign, it's all about war and establishing Rome's dominance, and also his own dominance over the Senate, which, to be fair, he creates. Julius Caesar's career is the story of one senator's rise to preeminence over all the others, and also he is someone whose best deeds are in war. He conquers Gaul famously, one of the most major undertakings of any Roman commander ever, and he also wins an extended civil war against Pompey and other opponents. So Caesar, while he doesn't establish a stable dynasty or really set up an apparatus to replace the Republic, he does set up the conditions under which someone else can come in and do that. Numa Pompilius effectively inherits the chaos of Romulus and brings order, morality, and law. In many ways, Augustus kind of does the same thing for the world that his great-uncle Caesar secured. Augustus implements many reforms, and he also sets up a new system of government, although he does so fairly obliquely, as we'll talk about in a second. So, in his own mind, Augustus might be a latter-day Numa Pompilius, and Livy certainly might see that in him as well. Augustus, while he did lead some campaigns during the second round of civil wars, he was certainly not much of a commander. He left a lot of that duty to his good friend Marcus Agrippa, and he was much more concerned with Roman morality and law. His whole principate, the system by which he could rule as someone disguised as a senator but functioning as an emperor, was really trying to align himself with the Roman tradition while recognizing that the way that things have been going under the full rule of the Senate was not really working. As for Tullius Servius, in my opinion, he is supposed to represent an ideal heir. Livy is trying to tell the Julio-Claudian princes of his day that if they want to be good kings, they need to learn from the example of Tullius Servius. Rule like he does by not rocking the boat and following the teachings of Augustus, but also be aware that you have rivals and that you might need to deal with them on occasion. Tarquinius Superbus is then the how to not guide on being princeps. He is paranoid, arrogant, oppressive, disrespects the Senate. He's everything that the Romans do not want and will not tolerate. So Tarquinius Superbus is exactly what the Julio-Claudian princes should aspire to not be. You should ask yourself, is what I'm doing similar to what Tarquinius Superbus is doing? If the answer is yes, stop doing it. And also, because Augustus establishes himself as king, or not king, but emperor, you might wonder, well, how is that acceptable? He wasn't chosen the way that Numa was. He more or less won the position the way that Tarquinius Superbus did through civil strife. The difference to both Livy and Augustus, I would presume, would be this. Augustus can claim to have more moral authority, auctoritas, because he has more honors and offices granted to him by the Senate. So he claims to be first among the Senate by virtue of his achievements. Tarquinius Superbus is more like a usurper in the sense that he simply seizes power. So, these are the considerations that Livy had in the back of his mind, at least in my reading of Livy's Book 1, when he was thinking about early Roman history. He also knew that Augustus would definitely read this work, and he wanted to make sure that his thoughts on early Rome reflected well upon his friend and mentor. As a final note, and as something of a preview for how modern scholars tend to look at early Rome, let us consider whether Livy's narrative in Book 1 contains anything that's easily recognizable as being historically anachronistic. Romulus founds a Senate of 100 members, and his successors both expand the institution and respect its rights which, in theory at least, must derive from these kings who created the thing. We also see that anytime a new king is appointed, that the Senate and people have a heavy role in this. According to Livy, when Romulus died, the Senate reserved the right to ratify or reject the people's choice, but the people themselves were responsible for choosing this person. That seems like an odd detail. That's typically not how monarchies work. So it seems as if Livy is imagining a monarchy as it might exist in his own time or in a time not too distant. Because he's working in a period where they don't know that much about how early Rome operated, he has to kind of make suppositions based on how things were at a later time and assume that this was also true deeper into the past. The question then arises, well, why would the Senate have this much power under a monarchy? And that's only one of the potential questions. Another that we'll get into when we look at modern views of early Rome is, were the Romans yet organizing the legions? Certainly when we imagine the armies of Romulus, should we be imagining the legions like the ones under Caesar, or something far more basic? Well, those are questions that we'll revisit. But Livy certainly seems to believe that Rome's military was largely in place from the start, and he employs the term legion when he talks about the armies of Romulus and the other kings. I would argue that that is anachronistic, but that is something that we will come back to when we look at the modern view of Roman history in the fifth and final part of this series.